together. And I'm delighted to be here. My husband and I moved to Crathes a year ago. We'd been living in Cults, Aberdeen, before that. And so it was a great summer to be here in this beautiful part of the world. Lewis once told someone that his definition of heaven was Oxford lifted up and put in County Down, Northern Ireland. And that was his playground, because Lewis lived in East Belfast and County Down's sort of the hinterland beyond that. So you've got the Moor Mountains, you've got Strangford Loch and so forth. And I understand his love of that, because actually that was my playground growing up too, because I'm also from Belfast. And but even we lovers of County Down have to concede that this is indeed a very beautiful part of the world. So yeah, we'll be talking about Lewis this week, and then next week we'll be thinking a bit more about Narnia. So setting the scene this week, and the sort of, you know, who was he? He is most famous for writing the Narnia stories at the minute, various other books. Probably the most quoted in sermons and books at the moment, often quoted. So if you've been part of the Christian tradition for any length of time, you will have heard his name. Let's warm up with a few questions to you. Just, you know, we'll get just to see. Let's just get warmed up on it. So. There's one more there, I think, too. Yeah. So, first question, easy one, I'm giving it away. Where was Lewis born? Belfast, yeah, that's the easy answer. When was he born?
1800.
And here,
19.
More or less, 1898. Yeah. And when did he die?
1963.
1963, yeah. What was his day job?
Academics.
Lecturer in
Linguistics.
in Oxford and then later on Cambridge. And the subject was English. Yeah, it was English. That was his primary subject, especially medieval and Renaissance, so he just lumped them all together. So, here's one. What kind of books did he write? Yeah, theology, yeah, kind of. He certainly...
Apologetics.
Sorry?
Apologetics.
Apologetics, yeah. Fantasy, yeah.
Space fiction.
Sorry?
Space fiction.
Yes, he did.
For
Yeah.
children. For
So
children.
Yeah. We run out? He did write essays, you know, there'd be essays published. He wrote poetry. He wrote books that weren't apologetics, i.e. defence of Christianity, just books thinking about the Christian faith. For example, The Abolition of Man is thinking, sort of almost predicting what way the world is heading if it keeps going in a trajectory. And then often forgotten, he did write books on literary criticism. The universities still sometimes use them today. That was his professional work. And there was one, I did bring it with me, a tome. It took him 20 years to write, and it's English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. And it became such a burden that he used to refer to it. It was under the heading of Oxford Handbook to English Literature, and he used to refer to it as Old Hell, OHEL, because it just was 20 years of hard grind to write it, but it's incredibly detailed. It happens if anybody's interested, it's just so knowledgeable. And then he also wrote space fiction or adult fiction. There's the 3 science fiction novels that just creak with ideas and theology. And then my personal favourite, which is less well known, which is Till We Have Faces. And it's a mythical tale, and he wrote it late in life. And it's set in an ancient culture about a veiled queen. Okay, 2 more questions. For what was he most famous during his lifetime?
On the radio, maybe? These talks on the radio.
Yes. He did radio broadcasts, and those became the book that's called Mere Christianity. And then he also wrote for an Anglican paper called The Guardian that no longer exists. He also wrote a series from a senior devil to a junior devil. Secretive letters. Yeah. So that was what he was most famous for during his life. What was he most famous for? What is he most famous for writing now? Narnia. So it shifted as the times have gone on, it shifted. And we'll talk about Narnia next week, but there's no signs of Narnia disappearing because Netflix is working on, with Greta Gerwig, so she directed Barbie, and it's a new version of The Magician's Nephew, which she started with first, because although it wasn't written first, it's about the creation of Narnia. And so she's starting with that first. I don't know if she's going to do others, but it's rumoured to star Daniel Craig, Meryl Streep, Carey Mulligan, Emma Mackey. These are the rumours, but it's not going to be out for another year or so, so you're going to have to hold your breath. But I don't think it'll be disappearing. I don't think Narnia will be disappearing. Although, whether it'll be recognisable as Narnia, as we know it when we read the book, who knows? So tonight we're going to look at Lewis himself. What was his journey to faith and who accompanied him? What can we learn from someone who had such an impact? And these talks are coming from a Christian perspective, and the primary nuggets I'm going to offer you will be a deep appreciation of the way he used his God-given gifts of thinking, writing, and also creating imaginative worlds for us to enjoy and benefit from. So, the Narnian. People are rather inclined to find his life fascinating, so this is a biography by somebody called Alan Jacobs, and this particular one does focus on the Narnia aspect of his life, and it's good within that framework, but there's other biographies too. But for Lewis, he didn't think the writer should be the focus of attention. He thought you should look at the work and not the person, and I think he had his own reasons for that, for not being comfortable with that. But for many of his fans, his personality is all part of his charm, and he was famously opinionated and argumentative at times, and whilst many who knew him paid really deep tribute to him and found him compassionate and loyal and helpful, there were some who found him a bit intimidating because he did love a good debate. But anyway, here we go. Clive Staples Lewis, born 1898 in Belfast, had an unremarkable but highly imaginative middle-class upbringing. His father was a lawyer, maybe where he learned his debating skills from, court lawyer. His mother was a maths graduate, somewhat unusual in those days, one of the first, I think, to go to the university I went to, Queen's University. And he had an older brother, Warren, or Warning. And in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about growing up with a lot of books and a lot of freedom to read them. Books too deep in the great bookcase in the landing, books in the bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder, he said, in the cistern attic, books suitable for a child, books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. And it did actually, for the first time when I read that, it did make me think the first time, is that why the Irish are writers and storytellers? Because actually, rains again. Weather affects us. So, Lewis's early years were happy. His family was comfortably off. You know, they had a nanny and a cook, I think. They had a wide family nearby that he paid tribute to as being kind and witty, and so it was a very privileged upbringing until the age of 10, and that's where he lived. His father built that house, Little Lee, which is still there in East Belfast, privately owned, so you can't go and see it. But when he was 10, then his mother died of cancer, and his life really was abruptly changed. Then his life was never easy after that. Ever, there was always difficulties for him, and his father, when his wife died, really didn't cope very well at all. He sent I think maybe Warren had already gone to boarding school, but he sent Lewis at the age of 10 off to a boarding school, which he'd agonised over but chose badly. And these series of boarding schools he went to were all, well, I'd say 2 of the 3 were decidedly unpleasant. One of them he called a concentration camp, and the head teacher was certified insane at a certain point, so it was really difficult place for a young boy to be in. And briefly as a teenager, he sort of tried to believe in God, but the school, I think, it was also mixed up with fear and whatever else was going on, that he came to associate the Christian faith with that kind of fear, and that sort of rocked his faith, or he just didn't follow it. And then as an older teenager, he was sent off to a tutor who was he was an atheist, he was very rational, and he seems to have knocked any vestiges of belief out of Lewis. And so Lewis gladly set it aside and became an atheist, and chose to believe only in the material world. There was nothing beyond what he could see and touch. And in 1917, he went to Oxford after the tutor had prepared him for great slavery. And he studied, at that point he studied classics and philosophy. And however, though he hadn't been there long whenever the First World War broke out, and so he ended up in the trenches on the French front, was wounded by a shell and discharged. And he doesn't make a lot of it. In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, sort of plays it down, and his autobiography focuses really on his journey to faith, how he did then find his way to Christianity as an adult through a series of steps, which led him, he said, to becoming the most reluctant convert in all of England at the age of 33. So it's a long process over many years. Now, his conversion was very carefully considered. He dialogued with the likes of Tolkien, and really, you know, as I said, going right throughout his 20s, one of the things he had to do was work out where he stood for the purposes of his philosophical studies. He felt he needed a position, so that was one of his issues as he tried to think through, you know, why are we here? And as he inched towards the idea slowly, there was some kind of supreme being or primary being. And if you've read, how many of you have read Surprised by Joy? Quite a few of you, yeah. Well, you'll be aware, I remember reading it and loving it, but not following half the references, because it is aimed at, you know, I think it's really aimed at his academic peer group in a way, and of course the references are very different, you know, 100 years ago in Oxford, but it's still, you still get a lot from it, I think. But so combined with this theoretical process, there were other factors that led him to believe in God. So one was his increasing belief that the world was more than the material world. And so if you flick on to next to A, you won't probably be able to read it, and it doesn't really matter actually. This slide isn't one you have to read. Some of the others I hope you can read. But basically Lewis had to sort of come to terms with the fact that there was more than just the material world. In his reading, he came up against spiritualism, the occult, theosophy, and that was having a fashionable moment, all of that at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, so that would have been in the air. And he also met people he knew who believed these things, and so on the slide we've got that person is W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, who Lewis had always enjoyed as a young person, but Yeats was very into that sort of esoteric minder end of the occult, I suppose you would call it. And Lewis had to begin to acknowledge that actually other people said there was more than just the material world. And so he started to acknowledge that, although he desperately wanted it just to be the material world. But he did find that he could feel the power of these things, he could feel the kind of lust for the power of the occult, and the hunger for those insights, but he could see in the people he knew consequences that were not attractive to him. including W.B. Yeats and others that he knew that he doesn't name but he refers to. And so the next slide is a quotation which it's one of my favourites actually. Experience, he said, is an honest thing. You may take any number of wrong turnings, but keep your eyes open, and you'll not be allowed to go very far before the warning signs appear. You may have deceived yourself, but experience is not trying to deceive you. The universe rings true wherever you fairly test it. The universe rings true. So pay attention, watch, and experience will prove things to you. And so, I suppose that's what he did all his life. Tested things, watched, looked for the consequences. He was always weighing up ideas against reality. And so one of the other things that helped him, so he was having to think philosophically, he was having to look at experience around him. He also found himself helped by something called joy. And that's joy with a capital J. And although his autobiography is called Surprised, so his autobiography is called Surprised by Joy, which is a reference to so it's his own term, it's very particular to Lewis, and by joy with a capital J, he meant longing and desire. And he first felt it as a young child looking at a little toy garden his brother had made. And it was beautiful, and he felt this longing, this desire for something. Later on, he would find it in Celtic mythology, which he loved, and he would find it in music. And throughout his life, he used to pay attention to this longing and where was it pointing him. Sometimes he also used the German word Sehnsucht, which means sort of sweet desire. And he really loved the sensation of it. Sometimes he'd even tried to recreate it. But he realised that the desire wasn't for the object, it was for something else. It seemed to be pointing him towards something else. And he came to see so the hunger that the occult stirred in him wasn't it, or the erotic wasn't it. There was a desire for something that ultimately he believed pointed us to God, this longing. And he spoke of it in a sermon called The Weight of Glory, which is a really beautiful sermon if you've ever come across it, The Weight of Glory. And he talked about this and he said it's a secret because he said people don't really talk about longing. And yet I think we all feel it. Now, I really appreciate that he talked about it because I think we do all understand longing. I kind of wonder if it was more extreme in Lewis, if it was almost like part of the gift of who Lewis was, that it was magnified. But I still think he was right to say that we all feel longing, and I didn't put the quotation in here, but the idea that it is there, it's on that. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. And so these are all different things that played into his conversion to Christianity, as did his taste for holiness. He always found goodness attractive, he said. He said some people don't find goodness attractive at all. Many better people than him, he said, didn't like it. But he really liked goodness. It had a charm and it drew him to certain writers, the likes of G.K. Chesterton or George Herbert. And the next slide, it wasn't just moral uprightness that called him, but it was a quality. And he referred to it as the bright shadow, which is more or less holiness. And he first identified it in a book bought in a railway station in his late teens by a Scotsman called George MacDonald from Huntly, some of you might know of. Many people here, yeah, a few hands up, yeah. So he was a Victorian writer. Some of his novels are set up here. They have Doric in them. They're set in Aberdeen and Cullen. And fortunately, you can get, it says George, fortunately, you can get ones which have the Doric, a parallel translation. George is from Peterhead, my husband, so it's still helpful sometimes to have the parallel. But anyway, George MacDonald also wrote 2 fantasy books, and one's Fantasties and one is Lilith, and they're really considered the forerunner of the genre of fantasy. So realistic novels and then these 2 fantasy novels, and they're profoundly interwoven, very dense with meaning of theology and so forth. And when Lewis read it, it just, as a teenager as he was, and some find these books very dense, but it just transformed Lewis. He said his sensation of longing had left the world around him untouched, but the taste of holiness that he found in those books, he said the bright shadow didn't just affect him, it transformed the way he looked at the world. And that was, in a way, in his late teens, the beginning, I think, of his journey. And in fact, he said it made the rest of the world seem disenchanted. Joy made the rest of the world seem disenchanted, but the holiness that he found in the work of George MacDonald made the rest of the world seem enchanted. It just completely changed it. And he said that baptized his imagination. He looked at everything differently. And it was one of many steps in his long journey. And at first, he kind of concluded he sort of came to believe in a sort of vague entity that wasn't a specific God, just a vague sort of theism. But increasingly, he said he felt something approaching, closing in on him that was more personal. And so Lewis's final year as an undergraduate at Oxford was spent studying English. No, I'm not sure when this, I think the sensation of closing in was later, but I'm going back a bit to when he studied English. And that's when he went on to teach. And he said, and this is maybe the last point of his conversion, that the writers he found most satisfying were those who insisted irritatingly on believing the Christian mythology. That's what he called it, the Christian mythology. And so he felt everything was lining up against him. His favourite writers were lining up against him. People were lining up on the side of the supernatural, even the side of Christianity. But he still saw any God figure as the adversary. He talked about his adversary moving in like a chess game. Checkmate. And whatever move he made, he felt this adversary making a counter move. And so then that which, and I think with the quotation, he said, that which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 2029, I gave in and admitted God was God. Knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not see then what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even in such terms. For Lewis to accept that God became human in the person of Jesus of Nazareth was still the final step that he had to make. And so having accepted that God was God, he then still had to accept Jesus. And he struggled to believe in a particular God, for a particular religion, what about the other religions? And it was an uncomfortable journey for him. Starting to attend church, he said the botheration of it all. And he didn't want to be part, he hated being part of a collective, and he had to work through those things. But he knew that for the ancients, to philosophize wasn't just about thinking. You had to do, you had to act, you had to choose a way of life. And so his conversion to Christianity then took him in a whole different trajectory in life, a whole different direction. It actually made him less popular with his peers at Oxford. Well, they'd never been popular, but it was an uneasy relationship because he wrote books, he started to write books about Christianity, and they didn't think that was his remit. He should have stuck to his line of expertise. And as we said, he was asked, one of the things he did was write books. He wrote a book during the Second World War, which became Mere Christianity, and that was really just to boost the nation's morale. The BBC approached him. So you have a whole series throughout the 40s of Christian books being published, defensive of Christianity, a logical defence. Because Lewis had two sides to him. He had this highly rational side that could argue for Christianity, and then he had this really imaginative side. And he said the imaginative side was the older impulse and the deeper one in some ways, and in his final decades that is what he returned to. Focusing on writing fiction, so he wrote the science fiction trilogy, Narnia, which is frankly a rather strange choice for an academic who's a bachelor who said that he didn't know what to say to children anyway, and yet he wrote this, and we'll talk more about that next week and why he did it and so forth. But throughout these years he was unmarried, he was living in a household on the edge of Oxford in this house called the Kilns, with a woman called Janie Moore, who was the mother of his friend Paddy, who'd been killed in the war, and her daughter, who was about 6 years younger than Lewis, and his older brother Warney. And Warney was one of this band of writers who met in Lewis's rooms in the college, and that's the Inklings, that's what they called themselves, and they would meet once a week in Lewis's rooms on a Thursday night. I think they also met in the pub sometimes, the Eagle and Child, and they all loved literature. They weren't all academics of literature, but they all loved literature, and they were all writing, and they would get together and read each other's books or other books, and that was part of what they did, was read aloud. And they did all tend to identify as Christians in all shapes or forms, and they had a particular interest, although not exclusive, in sort of fantasy writing. They all, say for example George MacDonald, non-realistic fiction, and apart from Lewis, the most famous is J.R.R. Tolkien, and his son Christopher, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and others, sometimes 10, upwards of 20 in gang. And Tolkien doesn't need any particular introduction. He had a complex relationship with Lewis down through the years, but there's no doubt that Lewis had conversations with him which were very significant for becoming a Christian, clarifying some of his thinking, and also for his writing. And Lewis honoured him in his work. He would turn up in his writing in various ways, some of his ideas, and then they both agreed that they couldn't find enough of the books they liked to write, so they would write them themselves. So that's really what started Tolkien on Middle-earth, and Lewis wrote history, science fiction books. And I think Tolkien might not have managed to finish Lord of the Rings if it hadn't been for Lewis encouraging him and prodding him. And Tolkien did say to his son Christopher that he knew that he turned up in the science fiction books of Lewis. He'd been Lewisified, he said. So they're very great, with their vivid imaginations. They did encourage each other. Charles Williams was very different, very literary, an editor and a writer. His books, I don't know, I really am still puzzled, as are many people, because those who knew Williams adored him, but he did have a strange fascination with the occult. He had a strong belief in God, believed very much in the way of love, but he did have this strange fascination, and so there's a lot of people sort of still trying to get their heads around that one. Owen Barfield was another who was a huge influence in those. So part of it was they went in different directions, and so spent years discussing these different directions. Barfield was an anthroposophist. And Lewis loved these dialogues. He loved these conversations with people who were the same but different. That was all the way Lewis was wired. So the Inklings were critical of each other, but enthusiastic, and some work may not have actually been published if it hadn't been. Lewis himself said that his debt to them was incalculable. I mean, they weren't all of the same mind. One of them, called Hugo Dyson, I think he's Irishman, he would groan audibly when Tolkien would start reading aloud. He didn't like the elves. So, they weren't all of the same opinion. And there was variety, and that was very acceptable within the group. I love this. I do think England has a high acceptance of eccentricity, and I think you could say the Inklings maybe could veer towards a bit of eccentricity, certainly very highly individualised, but Lewis enjoyed that, and he spoke of a unity of unlikes, and he portrays this beautifully in one of his science fiction novels, That Hideous Strength, where he has this little gang of people at a collective known as St. Anne's, and they're all gloriously different. They all have faith, but they're such different personalities and approaches and levels of faith. You've got, the academic, and you've got the spiritual guru and so forth. And then he compares that with, there's a particular scientific group who are all academic group, and they're all about competition, and they're distinct enough that you can tell them apart, but there's also this sort of flatness to them, this greyness, and their sort of competitive shadows, if you like, and we'll come back to this later on. So this variety and acceptance, I think the English would have survived 20 years if it hadn't been that. That was the spirit of it, and I think that's a wonderful thing that they cultivated, and it was very much in Lewis's approach to life. But for all that differentiation, Lewis did have a sort of orthodox approach to Christianity. Mere Christianity is taken from the Puritan Baxter, but he didn't want to be drawn down a denominational line. If you look at the scholarship, the Orthodox, Orthodox Church often think Lewis is ours. He fits in with Orthodox theology. Catholics claim themselves. Everybody thinks Lewis, because he managed to walk that line where he wasn't sort of pulled into sectarianism. And he said that at the centre of the Christian faith, someone always spoke with the same voice. And it did require a certain humility, I think. But there were other influences in Lewis. There were other friends, some of them, as it were, writers, and we'll think a bit about that. So George MacDonald or other medieval writers. And we'll think a bit more about the way they shaped his imagination next time. But there was also another influence in Lewis's life later on, and that is Joy Davidman, who he married at the age of 58. American woman. She had 2 sons from a previous marriage. Some of you might have seen The Shadowlands, or not The Shadowlands, but Shadowlands. Yeah, some of you might have seen that film, the story of their relationship. Joy, as a young woman, chose communism, and she was a published author, very vibrant, very highly, she was a good match for Lewis, academically or intellectually. We don't fully know the details of their love story. It was a complicated journey. Lewis's friends didn't always know what was going on. She was entirely different to the Oxford ethos she came over, and she just ignored the male world that Lewis was in, because the academic world then was male, and you weren't meant to get married, you weren't meant to, although some of them were now starting to, but it had that sort of medieval monastic thing. And so she just kind of ignored all of this, and initially they were just friends, and at what point, and Lewis himself said this, at what point he fell for her, it's hard to know. He married her, and it was, I think they had lived apart, because it helped her to stay in the country, away from her abusive husband. But at some point it did become a really deep, loving partnership, and if you've seen Shadowlands, you'll know the story's far from happy, because after only a little over 3 years, Joy died from cancer. So Lewis was devastated, and he wrote this book, A Grief Observed, under a pseudonym, thank you, since I say that. N.W. Clark, which means Nat Wilker, I know not which Clark. So, typical academic there, he's just enjoying it, but he didn't want it to be known that it was he who'd written it. And so people would say that you're grieving, you should read this book. Now it's published under his name. But Joy died in 1960, and Lewis at that point was 63, and his health was really fading. He had heart problems, he had prostate problems. He only lived 3 more years, but even in his early 60s, he was an old man, he was very limited. He was a single parent trying to bring up Joy's teenage boys, trying trying to help them. One of them became a Jew and get kosher food and so forth. And so Lewis, trying to fulfill his academic duties, trying to reply to letters, because all his life, once he became famous, he would have a lot of letters and he always wrote to the people. And that was highly arduous. Sometimes more than he would type them, he would But, and so he kept writing, and he wrote books in these years as well. Although I do enjoy the one experiment criticism, it's not his best. I love Letters to Malcolm, it's on prayer, and it's like a series of letters, and it's just a beautiful book about prayer. It's really lovely, very late book. But I've always found him a wonderful guide to literature. He's an amazing literary critic, and it's probably the area he's least known for, but he's really remarkable, except the trouble is we don't know these writers anymore. I mean, even then they were obscure writers. But his judgments are always interesting, very, very erudite, and even those who wrote books disagreeing with him still highly respected his opinions. And he did seem to have a photographic memory, so when he was writing, if he'd read something, he played this game. I'm really jealous. He played this game, take a book off a shelf and look at such and such a page, and then he could quote it. I have to be able to do that. But it does mean that when he writes his books, these memories are all there, so his books are so layered, and half the time we miss it because we don't know what he's referring to, or we've never read the classics, or we've never read that 16th century book. It doesn't really matter. I mean, that's what the Narnia books are like. They're layered with stuff, but actually, you just read the story and enjoy it, and you don't know how much erudition is there. So, I'll give you an example. In his book, The English Literature in the 16th Century, that he spent 20 years writing, he said, I think we'll have it too, whether you'll be able to read it, I'm not sure. Can you read that? No? I'll read it to you. So this is early on in the book. He says, the rough outline of our literary history in the 16th century is not very difficult to grasp. At the beginning, we find a literature still medieval in form and spirit. In Scotland, it shows the highest level of technical brilliance. In England, it has for many years been dull, feeble, and incompetent. As the century proceeds, new influences arise, changes in our knowledge of antiquity, new poetry from Italy and France, new theology, new movements in philosophy or science. But nothing is fresh, nothing is light, tender, or fresh. All the writers write like elderly men. The mid-century is an earnest, heavy-handed, commonplace age, a drab age. Then in the last quarter of the century, the unpredictable happens. With startling suddenness we ascend. Fantasy, conceit, paradox, colour, incantation return, youth returns. Nothing in the earlier history of our period would have enabled the sharpest observer to foresee this transformation. This is just an example of how he brings literary criticism alive. Now, it's also, as I said, I have the book, it's also incredibly detailed too. He doesn't, I like this bit, he doesn't say you can work out why. I think somebody else has worked out what the change is, and I think it's a really interesting thing, but I'll not go there right now. In the book, there's this minute detail of writers of the drab period in contrast to what he calls the golden periods, and he really lamented that the golden literature wasn't, after the First World War, it wasn't acceptable. He thought literature kind of almost returned to a drab age after the First World War. I sort of trying to agree with him. If you think about literary modernism and how it all changed. And, for example, his contemporary T.S. Eliot, he never could understand T.S. Eliot's image that the evening sky looks like a patient sedated on an operating table. There was just couldn't get that kind of, he wanted the golden age, positive beauty, and so forth. And so the way post-First World War writers wrote, he found difficult, but he also saw that as happening in the past too. And so his literary criticism is still valued by many, but it is less accessible to us because we don't know the books he's talking about. But there is still much that he brings us to us. And there's one area I want to sort of finish with it for the next few minutes, because we could be looking at his imagination. We'll touch on that next week. But the specific area of his thought, which I think is really important for a time when we are really challenged by the digital world, and especially for young people, but maybe for all of us, it's affecting our identity. And people with who look at, say, influencers or monetizing gurus or so forth. I think people are finding it harder to know who they are in reality as opposed to copying somebody else. And Lewis wrote about this topic of identity. He called it the self. He believed that we're created by God and we're made unique and particular. And he loved the particularity of things, a pineapple or a puddle. He just loved, he relished that everything that God has made is so unique and so particular, and he thought we all were as well. He thoroughly enjoyed everything for itself, so he loved the particularity of his friends. And he said that in contrast, evil just devours. It doesn't, God makes us to be particular and sets us free to be that in ways. But evil just sort of devours. And so we can think of an example of this. We chose this in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where Edmund sneaks away from the other children who he's actually brought, because he's been told by the White Witch that he'll get Turkish delight if he brings them along, and he'll be a prince and so forth. And so when he goes to the witch's castle, he sneaks in and he sees all the creatures that have been turned to stone by the witch. There's wolves, there's bears, foxes, satyrs, centaurs, winged horses, dwarfs, Mr. Tumnus. They're all paralysed because they opposed the witch and they're turned to stone. And it's only because Aslan comes and he breathes on them that they're brought back to life. And so I'll read you this. We're told everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan, dancing around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colours. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch grass in silver, and the beech grass in fresh transparent green, and the larch grass in green so bright it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the hopeless rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. Plenty of particularity in there, in the colour, the sound, even the roles they adopt when they go out to fight the witch. Diversity and variety. Throughout the Narnia stories, the breath of Aslan is itself an image which Lewis uses to suggest how the Spirit of God brings life. Also comfort and strength and virtue, but also colour to the Narnians and to the children. This is a book on the topic that came out a couple of years ago. It's not an academic one, so it is very readable. So really, like that excerpt that I just read to you, creatures become fully alive when Aslan breathes on them. And autobiographically, Lewis didn't write specifically, explicitly, but it may be that Lewis himself felt that he had come alive in that way, more settled and more grounded in God, without energy being spent on other things. Certainly he does seem to find his writing stride when he converted in his early 30s. And so he also grasped, in the next slide too, that there's a paradox when viewed from, life is paradoxical when you view it from a Christian perspective. Human will becomes truly creative and truly our own when it is wholly God's. And this is one of the many senses in which he that loses his life shall find it. And I suspect it's one of the secrets to Lewis's achievement. He understood that his soul wasn't his own. He wasn't the author of his destiny. But in understanding that, he was able to let go of his tight grasp on his soul He allowed Aslan to breathe ideas into him, and we'll think about that next week, how he allowed that, how he received it, how he participated with God in doing that. He didn't force things, Lewis, but he didn't just sit back and do nothing either. And in that respect, I think Lewis, flawed human being though he was, he is nonetheless inspiring, because he did know how to partner with God and let Aslan's breath bring out the colour in him. He knew how to go further up and further in, as they urge at the end of the last battle. And I do believe it was really an element of his, a big element of the secret of his success. Just as the children in Aslan are called to do a task, Aslan, Lewis himself understood something of that, being called to do a task and how to cooperate with it, with all his flaws and failings.
Any questions you want, but so everyone can hear, we'll come around with the microphone. So put your hand up if you've got any questions.
Speaking to this? Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. You said latterly there, excuse me, that Lewis did not believe that he was the author of his own destiny. Am I correct in quoting that?
Yeah.
So, who was?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's not a phrase he used, those are my words and not his.
Right.
Yeah, so I can't say what he would have said, but he very much believed that, what his own words were was, we can't call ourselves our own. So he would definitely have said, in becoming a Christian, he became God's. But, and I will talk more about this next week, it's not that then he became a robot, but there was this, it's kind of an image of a dance actually, where God was the initiator and Lewis would watch and observe and see and respond. And I will just give some examples about how that actually played out in his creation of the Narnia stories.
There's another microphone there.
If I've read the Narnia books but none other of Lewis's writings, what first three books should I start with?
See, it does depend on your taste, because he wrote in so many different genres. Do you like literature?
Science fiction probably would be
Yeah, well then go for the science fiction, the three. First one, is shortish and simple. The third one's long and complex and unwieldy and crammed with ideas, and I love it. And it's not a really good book as such. It's a bit chaotic, but I just love it because there's so much in it that it's just crammed in. So if you like science fiction, there's three there for you. I do love Prayer Letters to Malcolm, though. It's just a lovely book too. And I love also the final one. Not everybody adores it, Until We Have Faces, which is his final fiction piece, and it's not science fiction, it's set in an ancient past, and it's kind of almost mythological, and the people who love it. I don't know if you'd fall into that category. Hope that helps.
Looking for other hands up anyway. Don't miss your opportunity.
Sorry. Did he interact with sort of theologians in the Inklings group, sort of socially and intellectually?
It's a good question, yeah. He had a funny relationship with theology because he wasn't a trained theologian. And so he sort of, I think the other academics thought he'd strayed a bit into theology and it wasn't his field. What's kind of slightly strange is though that the theology departments nowadays actually pick up on some of his ideas. They like the imagery he used. He was always orthodox, but they like some of his emphases. So actually he did impact theology indirectly. Did he have a lot of theological friends? I'm not sure. Did he read? Yes, probably. But he was always very keen to say he wasn't a theologian because in the academic world he wasn't technically. And he was very skilled. I was just reading today, Karl Barth, mid-20th century theologian, he came across his students and just thought they were all dreadful because they'd all latched into not really what Barth himself was saying, but this quite often happens. You know, the leader says one thing and the students don't quite get it. So he was very cross about that. So he had his opinions, definitely. Yeah. Does that? Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see that N.T. Wright quotes C.S. Lewis often
Yes.
in his talks.
Exactly, and Tim Mackey from the Bible Project is always quoting C.S. Lewis as well. So he's really impacting theology now, which is sort of fascinating because he was so adamant he wasn't one. What is a theologian anyway, Bo?
I'd just like to ask you about C.S. Lewis's sort of idea about women and what he might think of a female Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yeah, that's too complicated for me tonight. He wouldn't have been happy. He was hierarchical, I think, and he wrote that he wasn't happy about women priests. He did believe in a certain hierarchy. There is a woman who's written about this, Monica Hilder. She wrote 3 books about it, because she points out that it's not misogyny. It's a very complex thing, which is why it's too complicated for me tonight. But in a way, he thought there was a hierarchy, and he did think that we should all take our place. But he, in a way, thought that God was the ultimate masculine, and all of us are feminine in relation to God. And so therefore, when he's writing his books, he often has some of the best male characters they're not these macho heroes. They often have like female qualities, or they can be very humble or whatever. And you have some really fascinating female characters. And so it's a really complex question. It's a very different way of thinking to the way most of us think. So if you really want to know more, I suggest Monica Hilder. 3 books there.
Thank you so much. It's just been fascinating. I learned something tonight. I didn't know that unicorns had blue horns. No, I think you've given all of us just the urge to read more of C.S. Lewis and to find out more about him. So thank you so much. Please do stay on and have some tea and coffee. We haven't sold tickets for tonight or anything, but this church does support International Justice Mission. And if you'd like to make a contribution, we'll cover the basic costs, and then anything extra will go towards International Justice Mission. So please do stay around. Sharon's going to be here, and we can chat to her. So enjoy yourselves, and thank you for coming.